June 2nd, 2019. Robert Bob Thompson sat in his living room in a small town in Ohio, preparing for an interview he had avoided for 75 years. At 95 years old, Bob knew he was running out of time. His children had begged him for decades to talk about the war, to share his story before it was too late. He had always refused. Some memories, he told them, were better left buried. But now, facing the end of his life, Bob decided it was finally time to speak. 3 days after this interview, Bob Thompson passed away in his sleep. These were his final words about D-Day. Bob was 19 years old on June 6, 1944. He was a private in the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division. His unit was assigned to the first wave hitting Omaha Beach. Before they boarded the landing craft that would take them to the shore, Bob's sergeant had pulled the men together for a final talk. Bob remembered every word. The sergeant told them that half of them wouldn't make it off the beach. That wasn't pessimism, he said. That was mathematics. The Germans had the high ground. They had machine guns and artillery zeroed in on the beach. The Americans would be landing in the open with nowhere to hide. Half would die in the first few minutes, maybe more. Bob climbed into the landing craft with 32 other men. He remembered counting them. 32 soldiers, most of them teenagers like himself, packed into a metal box heading toward a beach that looked peaceful and quiet from a distance. The water was rough. Men were seasick, vomiting over the sides. Bob wasn't scared yet. Everything felt unreal, like a training exercise. He kept thinking they would turn around, that someone would call it off, that this couldn't actually be happening. Then the ramp dropped. The sound hit them first. Machine gun fire so loud and continuous that it sounded like ripping cloth. The man in front of Bob, a kid from Pennsylvania named Jimmy, stepped off the ramp and was hit instantly. He fell into the water and disappeared. Bob stepped over where Jimmy had been and pushed forward into water that was waist deep and red with blood. Men were being hit all around him, falling, screaming, drowning under the weight of their equipment. Bob made it to the beach. He didn't remember how. He ran through the water, bullets hitting the waves around him, and threw himself behind a steel obstacle on the sand. He pressed himself flat, trying to make his body as small as possible. The beach was chaos, bodies everywhere, men screaming for medics, explosions throwing sand and body parts into the air. Bob looked back at the water where his landing craft had been. Of the 32 men who had been in that boat, Bob could see only 6 others on the beach. The rest were gone, dead in the water or on the sand. 26 men gone in less than 5 minutes. Bob stayed behind that obstacle for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. Artillery was landing around him. Machine gun fire never stopped. Men tried to move forward and were cut down. Others stayed pinned on the beach, too terrified to move. Bob looked to his right and saw a soldier lying face down in the sand. He couldn't tell if the man was dead or just taking cover. Bob crawled over to check. When he rolled the soldier over, he realized it was his best friend from training, a kid from Iowa named Danny. Danny's eyes were open, but he wasn't seeing anything. He was dead. Bob didn't know how to process that. Danny had been alive minutes ago. They'd been joking that morning about what they'd do when they got to Paris. And now Danny was gone. An officer Bob didn't recognize started yelling for them to move. They couldn't stay on the beach. Staying meant dying. They had to push forward to the seawall, then up the bluff to take out the German positions. Bob forced himself to move. He ran across the beach, somehow not getting hit. He made it to the seawall where other soldiers were gathering. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in the barbed wire, then started climbing the bluff under fire. Bob didn't remember much of the climb. He remembered his hands slipping on grass that was wet with blood. He remembered stepping on something soft and realizing it was a body. He remembered reaching the top and firing his rifle at German positions without really aiming, just pointing and shooting. By the end of that first day, Bob's unit had achieved its objectives. They had taken the bluff, they had pushed inland. But the cost was staggering. Of the 200 men in Bob's company who landed on Omaha Beach that morning, only 68 were alive and unwounded by nightfall. More than 2/3 casualties in one day. Bob had survived. He didn't know why. He wasn't braver than the men who died. He wasn't smarter or faster. He was just lucky. And that luck felt more like a curse than a blessing. Bob fought through France, through Belgium, into Germany. He was wounded twice, neither time seriously enough to be sent home. He survived the Battle of the Bulge. He was in Germany when the war ended. And then he came home to Ohio, got married, had children, worked in a factory for 40 years, and never talked about the war. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. When people found out he'd been at D-Day, they wanted to hear about it. They wanted to hear about the heroism and the victory. Bob couldn't tell them what they wanted to hear, because what he remembered wasn't heroism. It was terror. It was watching his friends die. It was the randomness of who lived and who died. In the interview, Bob's voice shook as he talked about the beach. He was 95 years old, sitting in his comfortable living room 75 years after the battle, and he was still there, still hearing the machine guns, still seeing Jimmy step off the ramp and disappear, still seeing Danny's eyes staring at nothing. Bob said that people thanked him for his service, and he appreciated it, but they didn't understand what they were thanking him for. They thought he was a hero. He wasn't. He was just a kid who had been sent to a beach in France and had somehow survived when better men than him had died. Bob's daughter asked him why he had finally agreed to the interview after refusing for so long. Bob said he wanted people to understand what war really was. Not the movies, not the history books. The real thing. The terror, the randomness. The way good men died for no reason while others survived through pure luck. He said he didn't want to be remembered as a hero. He wanted to be remembered as someone who had been there, who had seen what happened, and who carried those memories for 75 years, so that maybe, just maybe, people would understand the cost of war. 3 days after the interview, Bob passed away peacefully in his sleep. His family said that giving the interview had seemed to lift something from him, as if he'd been carrying a weight for 7 decades and had finally been able to put it down. At his funeral, his grandson read from the interview transcript. The church was full of people who had known Bob as a quiet man who worked hard, raised his family, and never talked about himself. They learned for the first time what he had done, what he had survived, what he had carried silently for all those years. Bob Thompson was one of thousands of D-Day veterans who rarely spoke about their experiences. Many took their stories to the grave, unable or unwilling to share the memories that haunted them. Bob's decision to speak in his final days gave his family and future generations a glimpse into what that day was really like, not from a general's perspective or a historian's analysis, but from the view of a 19-year-old kid standing in red water watching his friends die. The greatest generation, they're called, the men who saved the world, but Bob didn't see it that way. He saw himself as someone who had been asked to do something impossible, who had somehow survived it, and who had spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of why he lived when so many others died. He never found an answer to that question, but in his final interview, he made sure that their sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. He spoke for the men who couldn't speak for themselves, for Jimmy, who died stepping off the ramp, for Danny, who died on the sand, for all the others who never made it home. Bob Thompson's final words were simple. Remember them, not me. Remember the ones who didn't come back. They're the heroes I just survived. 3 days later, he joined them. May he rest in peace.